Giles, can I just welcome you
It's very nice to be here.
to Housing Technology and our conference at 2015. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And you really went down like a storm.
It was a good group of people, and it was a really interesting subject. When you first asked me to speak, I was, what am I going to say? And the more I got into the subject, the more I realised that, you're at the sharp end of so many really important social issues, so many of our fears and fantasies about technology and how society is changing and how that change affects the vulnerable, particularly the vulnerable who are residents in social housing. So over the weeks thinking about it, I've warmed to my theme. In the session this morning, the gentleman who drove me over here, his sat-nav said he was in Austria the moment he picked me up. Things break.
Yes.
When I'm around. So the idea that I might talk about technology is something that's in a way funny, but it does affect our lives, and it is the subject of so many of our fears and anxieties about the future.
You mentioned about your congregation and also where you live in South London. Would you say that the good use of technology enables you to reach out to your congregation effectively?
Well, that's quite interesting because in my particular parish in the Elephant and Castle is a place where the whole idea of community has been eroded. It's very difficult to find ways in which a community is knit together. So something like the internet does provide a form of social togetherness, which I think needs to be a sort of supplement to sort of real togetherness. I don't buy the idea that, a friend on Facebook is more than a real friend. A real friend is more than a friend on Facebook. But nonetheless, I think they work really well as a sort of supplement, helping knit communities together.
Technology has brought many benefits,
Yeah.
of course, which we often take for granted. It is beginning to emerge that it can cause a range of, ethical and social dilemmas. How do you see these in the community that you're in?
We're squaring up to the fact that people live so much more of their lives in a sort of digital space. Well, does it or does it not abide by different moral rules to the ones that we inhabit in the sort of real world, as it were? Yeah. The play that's on at the moment in London called The Nether, which is about the idea that in the future there might be a world where you live so entirely online and just not with other people, but with, as it were, with pixels, and it's without consequence. That's a world we don't know how to inhabit morally.
Obviously, I was going to say our congregation,
but actually our delegates.
Their takeaway on something like this is obviously they're caught between a rock and a hard place, invariably.
Yeah.
On the one hand, business benefits and change and efficiencies are brought by smooth implementation of technology, for example.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, what you were saying is that will have severe consequences potentially.
Both good and bad. I think that's and it was ever thus. I was talking about the Industrial Revolution and the changes that came about through the Industrial Revolution, and the way people responded to those changes. And in many ways, there was greater efficiency, there was greater prosperity, and yet on the other, there was people fell through the cracks. The forms of social togetherness that had existed before then were pulled apart. And when, someone like Pugin, who may have built some of the almshouses of people who here sort of as nostalgic about the Middle Ages and nostalgic about a world before nasty technology came along, there's a little part of Pugin in all of us about this latest revolution.
As more and more intellectual jobs are threatened by technological replacement, how can those people, organisations readjust? That's as a society and reconnect with a sense of working together, than as individuals.
Of course, so there's two things there. One thing is that there's some things that technology could never replace. The fantasy, the hope, is that we find a shift into more creative ways of managing our time. Those are the sorts of things that become more important. you couldn't get a robot to give a speech this morning, or it doesn't work like that. There are some things that are sort of like intrinsically live, and those things will become more and more valuable, I think. So there will be changes, but there is also a fear that we'll be somehow made redundant. I mean, not just literally out of a job, but also like we will be. What point is there to you and me, George, if all of the stuff that we do can be done more efficiently by machines and computers?
You've just reminded me, when I was at school, the music teacher left, and therefore they actually had a recording of all the hymns.
Oh!
So therefore, it was a pupil who put on a reel-to-reel cassette and pressed play.
Yes.
You'd sing Jerusalem, and somebody was playing it.
But now you see, there's a prime example. Our reaction to that, and I'm sure yours is, that doesn't work.
No.
I mean, there's some technology which works, and there's some technology doesn't work. And the idea that you sort of like the vicar on a Sunday morning puts on a tape. There's some things, creative things, often, that you can't replace, and those will be prized, I think.
Then I guess on the flip side, your sermon could be broadcast to not just the congregation that you're in, but to others.
You can do that. And of course, the church, I mean, communications technology and religion have been very closely associated. I mean, that's the whole point about Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press and so forth. I mean, the printing press drove a ideological revolution, which was the Reformation. I mean, it changed the face of Europe, and that was driven by technology. I mean, that could not have happened. The Reformation couldn't have happened. Wolf Hall couldn't have happened. None of these things could have happened if it wasn't for the technological change of the printing press. There are all sorts of things that it makes possible.
I mean, how do you use resources like, for instance, TED? Have you come across TED lectures?
Yes, really good.
Yeah.
They're really good. But I must have seen a good half dozen of those and benefited greatly from them. I think people need to learn to be bored a bit more and be happily bored, and I think that's okay. Technology doesn't allow us to be happily bored. Thinks being bored is the ultimate sin. It has to be constantly being stimulated. That's another form of problem, I think, with it. I mean, I went and sat the other day. People rightly took the mickey out of me for this. So I decided to go and have an hour sitting in my church, just like on my own, doing nothing. And I got to about 15 minutes through, and I tweeted, sitting on my church doing nothing. I wasn't. What did I tweet? What did I tweet it for, John? What did I tweet it for? It's like madness. And everybody said, well, if you're really doing nothing on your own, you'd put your phone down, which is completely right. Yeah. But and I'm a victim of it. I mean, we find it really difficult to spend those sorts of times doing nothing on our own. Even just the whole idea of silence for an hour.
Yes.
Is something that is becoming more and more difficult in a world of digital overload.
And I guess just to bring it down to some of our congregation, our delegates, what would you say would be a useful takeaway for them, given the dilemma that we are in the social housing sector facing over the next,
Well, I just think, the example of the Industrial Revolution, I think, is that there's all sorts of positive changes and negative changes that are going on at the same time. Just be aware that that's the reality. That's what's happening with these revolutions. So people who think only good things are happening, they're being terribly naive. All those people that think this is a catastrophe, they're missing the point as well. So there'll be a mixture. So you have to be quite discerning about the consequences and critical about what's going on. I think the other thing that's really important is something about, particularly for your sector, is something about digital inclusion. My nightmare is that, Dickens wrote about the people who fell between the cracks in the Industrial Revolution and its consequences. And there will no doubt be somebody who does the same sort of work on our world as well. And it'll be not post-industrialization, but, the post-digital age. And what does falling through the cracks look like? And I suspect, there'll be people on their own. There'll be people who've, as it were, been cut off from communities, for whom communities have been lost. They have a computer, but they have nothing else. And that there'll be a form of aloneness and a form of existential ennui, a form of sort of like misery that is completely different to what we've had before.
And finally, really, how have you found housing technology?
Great, I've loved it. It was really interesting, and it was a more intellectually stimulating exercise to come here and talk to you lot than I thought it was going to be. It's really important. It's really important. You're sitting at the nub of a particular sort of moral social problem about how efficiency, which is being pushed upon you in your sector quite hard from politicians and from business models and so forth, when that's coming through, but also you're looking after a great many vulnerable people. I mean, many thousands of vulnerable people. And putting those two things together, you have in your hands, a big moral issue. It's very important.
Giles, thank you very much for your time. I hope you can come again.
Very good to be here. Very good
Thank
to
you.
be here, George. Thank you.